This is Dr. Robert Epstein. He is a Harvard PhD. He's the former editor-in-chief of Psychology Today magazine. He was featured on Larry King, Fox News, CNN, Time magazine, and Scientific American, just to name a few. He's one of the world's leading authorities on sexual orientation research, and it's a real honor to have him with us to answer a few questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Epstein, for speaking with us. Can you just tell us a little bit about maybe your background and in more detail and how you came to have sexual orientation be the focal point of your work?
Well, sure. I've been a researcher for, I guess, almost 40 years. And over the years, I've taken on various topics, including creativity, adolescence, stress management, motivation, and some others. But in the early 2000s, I was editor-in-chief of Psychology Today magazine, and at some point, the advertising department of the magazine, so not editorial, which I was in charge of, but the advertising department ran a little ad for a book that I guess was controversial about sexual orientation, and we got some complaints about the ad. And in addressing those complaints, I got very interested in some of the issues involved, especially whether the labels that we use in describing sexual orientation, whether or not they're legitimate labels. And so that was now more than 15 years ago. And since then, I've gotten just more and more involved in this as a research topic. And at some point, I wrote an article for Scientific American called "Do Gays Have a Choice?" And for that article, I also developed an online test of sexual orientation, which is still out there. I think it's now in more than a dozen languages, and it's accessible at mysexualorientation.com. So I developed this now more than 10 years ago for Scientific American, and started really collecting lots and lots of data from this online test, which at this point, hundreds of thousands of people have taken around the world, not just in English, but other languages too. And that's really how my interest got started, and it's just kind of grown and grown over the years. And eventually I started analyzing the data, and I published a major paper on this topic, which had lots of surprises in it. That was in 2012. And then recently presented the largest sexual orientation study ever conducted. So as of when I presented it, which was a couple of months ago, there were 334,000 people in 107 countries in the study. It's actually grown much larger since then. So I've been learning about sexual orientation from lots of people, and my views on sexual orientation have really changed very dramatically over the years as a result of the research.
What can you say about the latest findings with sexual orientation research? Anything happening now that's changed quite a bit since when you started?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned recent news stories, because of course there are lots of news stories all the time about sexual orientation issues. And what they tell me is that people are actually somewhat confused about sexual orientation. I think there's a lot of confusion about it, and I think there has been for a long time. What the research that I've been directing, what that research is telling me and telling my colleagues is that some leaders in psychology and other fields, what they were telling us 100 years ago, people like Kinsey, people like Sigmund Freud, what my research is telling me is that what these people were telling us a long time ago is actually accurate and correct, and we've pretty much ignored them. That's what my research is saying. So what did Freud say? What did Kinsey say about sexual orientation, and what have we basically ignored? Well, first of all, this notion that that there are two kinds of sexual orientation, two flavors of human being, as it were, heterosexual and homosexual, is wrong, is quite wrong. And in fact, the notion that these two types of people exist as separate kinds of humans is actually very new. The term homosexual was not even invented until 1886. And believe it or not, the term heterosexual was invented after that, not before. It was actually invented after that. And it didn't even mean, when it was first used in the early 1900s, it didn't even mean what it means today. It meant someone who was in an unhealthy way kind of obsessed with members of the opposite sex. That's what heterosexual really meant in the beginning. So these two, the notion now, which has become so common, that there are two kinds of people, heterosexuals and homosexuals, or gays and straights, is very, very, very new idea historically, and it's wrong. It turns out it's completely wrong, and that's what my research is confirming now in a very big way. It's confirming that the kinds of statements that Sigmund Freud made and the kinds of statements that Alfred Kinsey made about sexual orientation were in fact correct. So what did these people say, you're wondering? Well, Freud, in fact, thought that heterosexuality was abnormal. Freud thought that it was a kind of a neurosis, and that, if you're just preoccupied your whole life with members of the opposite sex, mainly because of societal pressures that say you have to be, then you're going to be unhappy. You'll be in conflict for your entire life. That's what Freud said. And he actually said that more emphatically toward the end of his career. He said it early in his career, and he kept saying it. And toward the end of his career, he said it even more emphatically. And Alfred Kinsey, who, of course, is the first one to do large-scale sex research starting in the 1940s, he said something similar to that. He said that bisexual tendencies, or in other words, attractions to people of both genders, is actually pretty common, and that that someone to be exclusively attracted to someone of the same gender is actually not as common as you would think. That's Kinsey. And Kinsey also was very clear that sexual orientation lies on a continuum from same-sex inclinations to opposite-sex inclinations. And, there's a pretty smooth continuum there. So in the big paper that I published in 2012, which was a study with almost 18,000 people, that's pretty much what we found, that sexual orientation is really on a continuum. If you ask people about their actual inclinations, their attractions, their fantasies, their actual behavior, now and in the past, what you find is that sexual orientation measured that way falls on a continuum. That is, there are some people who have, pretty close to exclusive same-sex attractions, some who have pretty exclusive opposite-sex attractions, but most people, probably 90% of us, are actually somewhere in between. So really, that big study we published a few years ago, as I say, about 90% of us turned out to be somewhere in the middle between, exclusive same-sex inclinations and exclusive opposite-sex inclinations. So that's really what, of course, Freud was saying, and in effect, Kinsey was saying something quite similar. Kinsey was saying sexual orientation falls on a continuum, and our findings on that fairly big study we did back then confirmed that. Well, now we have much more data from around the world, and if anything, our data are telling us even more clearly that Kinsey was correct. Sexual orientation lies on a continuum. That there are very few people who appear to have, opposite sex inclinations. They're exclusively throughout their entire lives. There are very few people who have exclusively same-sex inclinations throughout their entire lives, and the vast majority of us are in between. Now, there's also research, not mine, but there is research done by other people showing that with women especially, the inclinations that we have, that they are also somewhat fluid, that they change over time. So there is that too. There's fluidity, and then our research shows another thing too, which is flexibility. That all of us not only have some particular point on the sexual orientation continuum where we're kind of centered, but we also have some degree of flexibility. Some of us have a lot of flexibility. Some of us have less flexibility. So continuum, that's one issue. Flexibility, that's a second issue. Fluidity, that's a third issue. So if you really want to get to the truth or closer to the truth about sexual orientation, you've got to always keep in mind these three things. There's a continuum, and people are distributed all over that continuum. There are relatively few people out at the extremes of the continuum. And then secondly, flexibility, that we have a certain amount of flexibility in moving this way or that along the continuum. Some of us have more flexibility than others. And then finally, fluidity, that in fact there is some degree of change that occurs in sexual inclinations as we grow older. So those are the three key concepts. And again, the research we've done now, the big study we reported recently, again with 334,000 people in 107 countries, it confirms all three of those ideas. So that's just a starting point, to begin to talk about sexual orientation. That, to me, in my mind, just starting with these basics, to me, that's just a starting point. Going from there to how we should live our lives and what our options are. Wow, you can go in all kinds of different directions. But those three basic issues, that's the starting point.
Well, just going back, like historically, you're talking about Kinsey and Freud's research and how it seems that the rest of the world was very selective in what was, brought to light or shined a light on. Why do you think those parts of their research was so kind of buried or ignored? I mean, what about that research and about that time do you think that was just so buried?
Well, that's a very good question, and that has to do with societal values and, in particular, a kind of pressure that society exerts on us to behave a certain way and label ourselves a certain way. Now, if we go back in time, so now we go way back before Freud. Freud did his writings in the very late 1800s, early 1900s. Well, if we go way back in time to, for example, the period when the Bible was written, and so now we're talking about a couple thousand years ago. And then we move forward about 600 years to when the Quran was written. The major religions that are with us today, took stands against same-sex sexual behavior. They took stands against it pretty much. So they didn't have labels for gays and straights. Those labels are not in these ancient religious texts, but they definitely took stands against same-sex sexual behavior. Now, why? Well, people have speculated. People have written about this. You could say, I suppose, that if you can get control over people's sexual behavior, then you can control them in every manner, shape, or form. So the major religions, again, took a stand. The major religions took a stand against same-sex sexual behavior. One issue might have been a control issue, which is namely that if you can control someone's sexual behavior, then you control anything about them. Maybe that's an issue. Another probably just has to do with the obvious, which is procreation. These religions evolved during an era when the human population began to grow very rapidly. For a very long time in the distant past, the human population stayed pretty small, But as society became more organized, as civilizations grew, as we found ways to basically to mass produce food, for example, basically as we got more organized, there was now a possibility for the human race to expand very rapidly. And the major religions, all of them, encourage the expansion of the human race. They all urge you to populate. The very first, if you dig into the Old Testament, the very first commandment in there, the very, 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 very first one, if you look back and and look at the story of Adam and Eve, is be fruitful and multiply. And so this is true of all of the major religions. They really wanted us to, I mean, they wanted to be on top, I suppose you could say, and the way you get on top is making sure that your religion has a very, high growth rate. And so you could look at this pretty simple, which is, you want to encourage opposite sex interactions, because you want the population to expand, and you want to discourage same-sex interactions because, again, you want the population to expand. So, again, different ways to look at this, different ways to try to understand why things have turned out the way they've turned out. But the bottom line is there have been pressures, enormous pressures exerted in most societies around the world, encouraging opposite sex interactions, discouraging same-sex interactions, and that basically explains why we're kind of stuck where we are today. We're stuck with this notion that that homosexuality is a bad thing, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's even this kind of wrong thinking that homosexuals are somehow abnormal or inhuman or less than fully human, which is completely false. So, we're stuck with the thinking we have today, with enormous pressure for everybody, no matter what their natural inclinations. There's enormous pressure for everybody to, number one, label him or herself as straight, and number two, to behave that way. So right. The truth of the matter is that, it's easy to label yourself, but again, the truth of the matter is that it's harder to behave that way if in fact your inclinations don't really go that way consistently. And so we end up with all these, crazy debates that go on all the time, nonstop, between people who have one position or other about homosexuality. And we have also, of course, starting in the United States anyway, in the 1960s, 1969, we have the beginning of a movement to get basic rights for people who label themselves as homosexual, and the conflict and the craziness has not stopped now. It's been just dragging on, and I think it's going to drag on much longer. And the entire debate, the conflict, is based on faulty information about human sexual orientation. And by the way, one way I can quickly make the point is simply this. If you look around the world, in every country on earth, even countries that put people to death for same-sex sexual behavior, it exists everywhere. And it always has in every society on earth. So that alone seems to tell you something about the fact that it's actually quite natural. And then the other thing is, if you go into the animal kingdom and you just look at other mammals, you find it in pretty much every species that we've ever observed is literally same-sex sexual behavior has been observed, I think now, in more than 1,000 animal species. And our two closest relatives in the animal kingdom, one is the chimpanzee. We do find it among chimpanzees. We do find both, heterosexual and homosexual behavior among chimpanzees, or I should really say both opposite sex sexual inclinations and behavior and same-sex sexual inclinations of behavior in chimps. And then if you go to the other, our other closest relative, the bonobos, and we share 98.5% of our genes both with chimps and with bonobos. Well, bonobos are outrageously bisexual. All of them, each and every one of them that we have observed, they're all outrageously bisexual. And I think probably when it comes to sexuality, our inclinations are actually our natural inclinations. They're probably closer to those of the bonobo than of the chimpanzee. So, same-sex sexual behavior is perfectly natural in among humans and in the animal world in general. It's universal among humans, no matter what the prohibitions, no matter what the pressures. And it seems to be fairly universal even in the animal kingdoms, which brings me back again to those three basic concepts. The continuum, there's a continuum of inclinations among humans, and this notion of fluidity and the notion of flexibility. Those are the basics.
So when we're talking about the continuum and across history, is it perhaps that maybe a majority of the people fall on this continuum that you're talking about, more on the side of an opposite sex desire, opposite sex inclination, rather than a same sex inclination? Do you think that there is a percentage of people that lean more towards a heterosexual inclination rather than same sex?
I think there probably is some tilt in that direction, and our own data seem to suggest that there is some slight leaning in that direction, which like, kind of makes sense. I think evolution would want that inclination to be a little stronger, but I do not think in any way that even though maybe there is a little leaning in that direction, that produces any kind of homophobia. Homophobia, by the way, is a misnomer. I do not like that term. That means fear of, homosexuals, and no one's afraid of them, or ever has been. So the correct term is really homomisia, which means hatred of or dislike for homosexuals. And no, I don't think that just because some people, have stronger heterosexual inclinations, that gives rise to homomisia, to any kind of rejection of same-sex sexuality. Because again, if you look, back in history, you don't have to look very far, not at all. You'll find that same-sex sexual behavior has been tolerated around the world, even in Arab countries. It has often just been tolerated as something that some people sometimes do. And so it's not given rise to hatred or dislike, generally speaking. It's just been tolerated as something that some people do. And again, no label has existed until very recently for people who have exclusive same-sex inclinations. The label is very, very new. And same-sex sexual behavior itself was engaged in from time to time by all kinds of people. And they weren't labeled, just because you had a same-sex sexual experience, that did not give rise to a label. I just recently read a very famous book written in the 1700s called Fanny Hill, which some people think is considered one of the first, if not the first, pornographic novel ever written. It was written by a man named Cleland in the UK in the 1700s. And in Fanny Hill, you're following the life of a young female prostitute and her friends and associates in London. And it's really fascinating because now and then, they actually have sexual encounters with each other, not just with their male customers. And again, there's no label involved. It's just something that happens from time to time. There's also a very famous book of love poems written hundreds of years ago by an Arab aristocrat who was Muslim. And in that book, he's focusing on the loves and the affairs that he has had and that his male friends have had. And every now and then, the males fall in love with each other or have sex with each other, and it's just something that happens. There's no label that separates these people out as being somehow different. So, I think if anything, there's been enormous tolerance for same-sex sexual encounters. It's just generally being considered something that sometimes happens, something that some people sometimes do. So, again, I think the truth about sexual orientation is something most people just don't know. We've been told all kinds of false things, and a lot of us end up believing false things about sexual orientation, hoping over time we can straighten some of this out.
Yeah, because it seems like people are burying those feelings if they have them. They're um, unsure on how to even, because people want labels. It seems they want to like put an identifier to who they are, to identify themselves in a certain way, and people aren't necessarily consciously aware what these desires mean and why it's happening to them. Is that right?
We're very dependent on labels, and let me tell you another finding from the research that's quite interesting and relates to what you just said. Uh, yes, we're very dependent on labels, but sometimes labels are dangerous. Sometimes labels do harm, and that's definitely the case with sexual orientation. So one of the findings in our new research is the following: that is, for people who call themselves gay or who call themselves bisexual, if they stray from that label, again, this is what we find in our latest research, it doesn't really bother them very much if they stray from that label. I mean, how do you stray from the bisexual label? It's really hard, right? Because no matter what you do, it kind of fits, the label fits. If you call yourself gay or lesbian and you stray from that and you have sexual attraction for someone of the opposite sex, or you have sexual encounter, turns out that doesn't bother people who use the term gay or lesbian. It doesn't bother them very much at all. But we've also found that for people who use the term straight or heterosexual, when they stray from what that label implies, when they stray from that label, it really causes great distress. And the more they stray, the farther they stray, the greater the distress they feel about their sexual orientation. And again, all of that has to do with the pressures, again, that society is exerting nonstop, 24/7, to call yourself straight and behave that way. So, we feel very strongly that these labels are misleading for a lot of people, first of all, and actually cause a lot of distress for people, especially people who use the straight label. So we don't like these labels. We're trying to get away from the labels. And if people go and take our sexual orientation test, which is at mysexualorientation.com, they'll actually be given, instead of labels, they'll actually be shown where they are on the sexual orientation continuum and how much flexibility that they have, and with no labeling at all. You're literally just shown, and it's basically some numbers, and they show you where you are on the continuum and how much flexibility you have, and of course that just differs from person to person.
It seems like it would be so much more freeing for a person to know that that there's not just, well, I mean, I guess I could see it both ways, but to have that sort of more of, shades of gray that like you fall under, rather than these rigid boxes to be placed in, to have this sort of a sliding a scale that you're kind of that you're placed upon, but not only that where you are on that continuum scale, but that there is a flexibility and a fluidity that happens.